Okay, gang. Hello, and welcome to the last Medieval Work in Progress seminar of the autumn term. It seems rather incredible that term is almost over, given that it only began about 30 seconds ago. I'm Alex Bovey, the Dean and Deputy Director, and a proud member of the History of Art faculty medievalist contingent. And in that capacity, I have the great pleasure of filling in for Tom Nixon, who normally does the introductions at these seminars, but who can't be here this evening. And I know he'll be watching at home because this is one of his top favorite intellectual themes. It's a real pleasure to introduce to you Mads Heilskov, who is visiting the Courtauld as a postdoc, or rather resident of the Courtauld as a postdoc funded by the Carlsberg Foundation. And his time here was supposed to begin at some point during the pandemic, but then it got delayed. And so one of the great things about this year was finally welcoming you here to the Courtauld. And now we get to hear his talk. Mads did his PhD at the University of Aberdeen in 2018. And his preoccupation of his research is expressed in the Carlsberg funded project, which is about animated materiality in the medieval Catholic West. And I'm excited to say that that is really, I think, pretty squarely what he's going to be talking about tonight in his paper, Living Matter in Medieval Denmark. So I'm going to put my mask on and then clap to welcome him. I hope you'll join me in both of those things.
Thank you for a kind introduction, Alex, and thank all of you for coming, for defying all of the pandemic stuff. I will get straight to it then. Today's paper is based on my own contribution to the volume Materiality and Religious Practice in Medieval Denmark that I and Sarah Croix edited together, and which came out on Brepols a few months ago. The aim of this volume was primarily to emphasize the relationship between people and things in the Middle Ages, to highlight things as mediators between the human and the divine in the thought world and lived experience of medieval people. But we also wanted to showcase the little-known Danish material to our international colleagues, that is you guys, and give you access to it. We wanted to show that there is both similarities and dissimilarities between the Danish and the European material, and on that background enter a dialogue about materiality and religious practice, integrating these examples into the international discourse, which has tended to focus on England, France, Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands, thus often neglecting the periphery of medieval Christianity to the north as well as to the east. I will be saying a lot of Danish place names, so in order to give you a chance to follow what I'm saying, I've made you a handout with all of them on a map. For those who are with us online, you can see it here briefly. For the rest of you, it's on the table if Alex would maybe distribute it. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Now, the term animation as a threshold term serves to enable us to connect the spiritual and the physical aspects of the medieval religious culture. I argue that animation, in essence, enabled the divine to gain a body and presence, while the worldly sphere was simultaneously sacralized through this very connection. This was particularly true within the liturgical and devotional contexts, where the intrinsic potential for animation embedded within religious objects was activated, sometimes via mechanical and other times via miraculous agency. I will not argue that the mechanical and the miraculous were mutually exclusive, closed-off categories, as mechanical animation could very well be miraculous too, and vice versa. I will focus on three groups of examples. First, I will focus on an anthropomorphic polychrome wooden figure of the Holy Virgin. Then I will move on to relic-endowed crucifixes, and finally I will turn my focus to more abstract and in their outer form, non-anthropomorphic objects that animated. My separation of examples into these groups does not mean that I suggest that they fell into separate epistemological categories for medieval people. But it enables me to structure my argument in a way that elucidates different ways that objects were able to animate and to emphasize some central historiographical points along the way, not least about the impact of the Lutheran Reformation and the impact it had for the way the role of materiality has been dealt with in Scandinavian scholarship on medieval Christianity. In that context, I would like to emphasize that the Lutheran Reformation's history of effect in a longue durée perspective has had a particularly negative impact on the preservation of medieval artifacts. This is particularly true of liturgical manuscripts and church inventory, especially objects that fall under the category of Kleinkunst, but also larger pieces such as altarpieces, choir stalls, wooden figures, etc., which were of no perceived artistic or monetary value. Artifacts of perceived artistic or monetary value, on the other hand, have often been preserved in either full or fragmented form in private collections and have eventually ended up in museums during the peak of antiquarian interest in the 18th and 19th centuries. This preservation history has had a huge impact on the way artifacts were distributed between different academic disciplines, and following that, on how they have been treated in various disciplinary traditions. It has also had a very direct impact on the amount and character of the available sources for the subject of object animation, and you will therefore hear me go back and forth between medieval and post-medieval sources throughout my paper. My three headings for today's paper are between mimesis and illusion and anthropomorphic automaton, between embodiment and ensoulment, two relic-endowed crucifixes, and between immanence and presence, two non-anthropomorphic optic animations. As you may have gathered, the leading word here is between. That is to signal the role of materiality as mediator between spheres on the one hand, and our modern ambivalence towards that particular aspect of medieval religious materiality on the other. The phenomenon of living matter or matter that animated in one way or another is known all over Europe. And in Denmark, the earliest examples are from the 12th century. The early examples are, however, ontologically different from the late medieval ones, as they serve more as rhetorical constructs than occupy a place in experienced reality. For that reason, I have picked out a number of late medieval examples that will serve as background for my discussion here today. In the first part of my paper, I will focus on the possibly mechanically weeping Madonna from Caro in Jutland, the one that was on the cover of the PowerPoint presentation. Possibly, we'll get back to that. Such anthropomorphic figures, especially those with mechanical components, belong to one of the most debated categories among reformers, and were a common motif in anti-Catholic propaganda, blaming Catholics of idolatry. The reason for that is that the relationship between referent and representation was particularly murky within this category of figures, also among learned theologians. The Madonna from Karup is mainly known from an anti-Catholic Lutheran propaganda pamphlet from 1530, which exposes the miraculous weeping as mechanically construed fraud, made in order to deceive the pious but uneducated pilgrims. It is, however, also known from both written and material medieval sources, and is thus documented before the Lutheran ideas began to spread across Northern Europe in the 16th century. We know, for instance, that Queen Christine went on a pilgrimage to Karup in 1505. This is recorded in her personal financial accounts. Pilgrimage badges in the shape of a Sedes Sapientiae type Madonna naming Karup exist too, like this one, which we shall return to later. And the Madonna is named as receiver of pious bequests in nobleman Holger Eriksen Rosenkrantz' will from 1495. We also know that the Milanese papal legate and seller of indulgences, Johannes Angelus Archimboldus, here named by his Latin name, like in the sources we have about him in Scandinavia, ran his business at Karup Church between 1516 and 1518. Although medieval evidence of the cult of the Karup Madonna exists, it is still mainly linked to the tale of fraud that was disseminated in the propaganda pamphlet. The tale takes place at a tavern in the town of Skive, where a pilgrim named Asser Bonne is asking for directions to the shrine. While the pilgrim enters the tavern, a priest and a monk are discussing the Madonna's wondrous weeping and agree that if only more wonders like this would happen, the Lutheran heresy that increasingly left people immune to the material remedies of the church might be stopped. The pilgrim is answered by a man named Peter Smith, who informs him that he has heard that the miracle is hoax. The figure's head was hollow and filled with water, and its eyes were made so that water could run through them and deceive everybody into believing that it was miraculously weeping. Although the pamphlet's discourse is that of fraud, and its anti-Catholic sentiment is apparent, the story still provides a window to the lived reality of medieval religious belief. People believed in the miracle. They saw the figure as a physical extension of the Holy Virgin, and they were willing to travel far to venerate it and take part of the grace that flowed from its eyes. This belief, as portrayed in the pamphlet, must have been credible to a contemporary audience. If we are then to recreate the figure, we have multiple sources to draw upon, which give us a fairly consistent image of what it may have looked like. First and foremost, a Madonna figure from Karup Church, dated to around 1480, has survived, which may be identical to the miraculous one. It is a polychrome wooden Madonna of the Sedes Sapientiae type. It has no sign of any kind of weeping mechanism, however. A 17th century inventory compiled by the Rosenkrantz family when they annexed the church as their property also contains a description of a Madonna of the Sedes Sapientiae type. It informs us that the Madonna was placed on a throne surrounded by the celestial symbols. Beneath her were two kneeling figures with their hands folded and their eyes turned towards heaven. The pilgrimage badges from Karup, all dated to the last quarter of the 15th century, also show a Sedes Sapientiae type Madonna. One of them, the one we saw just before, was found in 1901 inside the altar table, where it was deposited as a relic when the church was consecrated in 1497. Another one was found in the floor layer of Breining Church in southern Jutland when it was renovated between 1960 and 1961. and the third one was found on the church bell of Hesselager Church on the island of Funen, which originally belonged to the Cistercian monastery of Jutland. The pilgrimage badges confirm the description in the inventory to some degree. The Virgin is shown in an aureola, which could be interpreted as the sun, but there is no moon, stars, or kneeling figures. On the other hand, the pilgrimage badges also match the surviving wooden figure reasonably closely. Together, the sources give a pretty concise picture. It was a devotional figure of a very common type, the Sedes Sapientiae. It may have been presented in an aureola with celestial symbols, and it was possibly placed on some kind of pedestal with kneeling figures. The mechanical weeping cannot be confirmed, but a credible contemporary example from Hamar Cathedral in Norway shows that such mechanisms existed in Scandinavia in the late Middle Ages. The Norwegian example comes from the writings of an 18th century priest who was walking in the by then ruined church. On one wall, he saw a damaged Gothic crucifix and decided to take it down to examine it further. He found that its head was hollow and that its eyes were made of a soft, spongy material. He concluded that this was a weeping mechanism and called it pious fraud. Whether we see the weeping as mechanical or miraculous, the sources together shows us that the cult of the Madonna was alive in Karup in the late Middle Ages, and that pilgrims interacted with the figure during prayer and devotion. We know from contemporary sources from Tuscany, for instance Prato and Florence, that pilgrimage badges played a central role in this interaction between pilgrims and the miraculous figure. Pilgrimage badges, which had touched the holy image, were distributed as amulets, which performed miraculous healings on their own. People used these amulets as devotional objects at home and during travels. They were hung on or near the miraculous image as ex votos, and people, for instance the Medicis, were occasionally buried with them. This way, the sacredness of the figure was able to be distributed and transferred via pilgrimage badges working as brandeer. At the same time, the accumulation of ex votos would authenticate the miraculous nature of the figure continuously, keeping the cult alive through the perpetual presence and exponential growth in numbers. That the pilgrimage badges could indeed become powerful relics in their own right is testified by the fact that one was used to consecrate the main altar at Karup Church. While it was relatively normal to use a consecrated host for this purpose, if no relic was available, it is highly unusual to use a pilgrimage badge. This just highlights how powerful the cult at Karup actually was. I argue that this dynamic relation and interaction between the figure, the pilgrimage badges, and the pilgrims continually authenticated the sacredness of the Madonna figure and ensured that it remained animated and alive. I argue, moreover, that part of the reason why this figure worked was its iconographic orthodoxy combined with its anthropomorphic shape. Its shape enabled it to communicate directly with pilgrims, and its iconographic type was culturally recognizable. It thus conveyed sacredness in an easily decodable way. If we accept that these attributes existed, the aureola showed that the figure was exalted, while the kneeling figures showed pilgrims how to behave in front of it. The Virgin's role as mother and mediatrix was supported by the Christ child in her lap, as well as by the kneeling figures. The heavenly and the human, the very axis that Christianity revolves around, met in the shape and iconographic program of the figure. I argue, therefore, that the potentiality of the figure was bound up partly on its outer physical characteristics and tangible presence, which followed an already existing convention regarding the idiom of the divine, and partly on the cultic practices that took place around it, using pilgrimage badges as extensions of its presence and a means of communication. These aspects combined simultaneously animated the figure and ensured its continued animation. Now, whereas the carved Madonna obtained its sacredness by its outer form and the practices it became the center of, figures could also be infused with sacredness and thereby potential for life via relics or consecrated hosts deposited inside them. Sometimes relics or hosts were hidden in cavities inside figures, and at other times they were placed beneath capsules of transparent materials, most frequently rock crystal. The topic of relics deposited within figures is not new, as it has been frequently debated in, for example, French and German scholarship. The phenomenon has even been written about using Danish material before. The general scholarly consensus is that figures turned into reliquaries when they were used to house relics, and that the figures served to show and authenticate the relics. In that way, the order of importance is clear. The relic determines the status of the figure. I would, without going further into the historiography, like to contest the general notion that figures simply turned into reliquaries once they held a relic, and argue that they constitute their own category of living matter. The figures were ensouled by the relics, which helped them gain the life they already had the potential to possess via their physical form and materials. In her article on relic-endowed figures from the historical Danish kingdom, Lena Lippe collected 13 examples. I have added 5 to her catalogue, so there are now 18 examples in total. The vast majority of figures with relics inside them that have survived are crucifixes, but that probably has more to do with crucifixes being more likely survivors than other figures than with a particular cultural preference for depositing relics in crucifixes. I will discuss one example that was included in Lena Lippe's catalogue, and 2 which were not. These are a pair and as such constitute one example. There are, in principle, 2 types of relic-endowed figures, and my examples cover both. The first type has relics attached to their exterior, usually visually enhanced by rock crystal capsules. The other has relics hidden inside them without any physical sign of their precious interior. The catalogue contains both life-size and monumental crucifixes, and there is no correlation between size and deposition strategy. This has to be determined from case to case. The first example I want to discuss is the large monumental crucifix made by Claus Berg in 1527. It was originally placed above the lay brothers' altar, which was consecrated to the Holy Cross, and placed between the lay choir and the monastic choir in the Cistercian Abbey of Sorø on the island of Zealand. The whole assemblage probably consisted of a double-sided cross altar, like is known from other Cistercian monasteries in Northern Europe. For example, Dover and Münster in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern in northern Germany. This is the largest preserved crucifix from medieval Denmark, and the cross itself measures nearly 8 meters in height. It shows a naturalistic presentation of Christ dying on the cross. Unfortunately, however, the paint is not original, but stems from the restoration that took place in 1846, where the crucifix was completely repainted. The crown is also unoriginal. It was added in 1641, when the crucifix was also removed from its original placement. The crucifix is being scientifically analyzed as we speak, and I'm anxiously waiting for what might be revealed. The group of conservators say that they have big news, so perhaps what I'm saying today will be old news and outdated pretty soon. We'll see. The 4 cross arms have images of the evangelist symbols surrounded by golden filigree. And on its extremities, the cross has carved cavities with rock crystal capsules on top, concealing the hair of Christ, the teeth of St. Paul, and other unspecified relics. It has been argued that the relics may have been transferred to the crucifix from its mid-13th century predecessor. On the foot of the cross, by the symbol of Matthew, we find the coat of arms of Lage Urne, Bishop of Roskilde, with the inscription XPS Vinci 1527, I Christ Prevailed 1527. On the reverse side of the cross, which originally faced the monastic choir, there is a painted crucifixion and the coat of arms of Henrik Tornekrans, abbot of Sorø Abbey and councillor of the realm. The inscription says Omnia in Laudem Dei 1527, all in the honor of God 1527. Although the paint is not original, it is evident that the figure of Christ was made with great realism, except for his size, of course. He's huge. His expression is relaxed. His jaw is hanging and the teeth are just barely showing. The eyes are slightly open while the side wound is gaping wide. The limbs are relaxed while the hair and loincloth show upwards movement. This type of figure with visible relics can be said to have had a similar role to that of a reliquary, since it showed the relics and augmented them. But its liturgical function was different, and its realism and plasticity was way more anthropomorphic than any body part shaped or even full body shaped reliquary. As the crucifix was hung high, the relics were not as such visible to spectators, but rather implied as a glimmer of light on the extremities of the cross tree. They were thus simultaneously enhanced and concealed by their container. Instead of relics, the lay brothers would see the glimmering light of divine presence emanating from the cross and surrounding the dying Christ. The symbolic value that rock crystal had is a well-known fact. Lapidaries specify that rock crystal was petrified water that symbolized spiritual purity. It was also associated with the rite of baptism, the descent of the Holy Spirit, and the incarnation of Christ in biblical exegesis. Some treatises specify that gems, including rock crystal, were alive and contained within them the cosmic event of creation itself. Rock crystal was thus a powerful mediator and visual aid for the deposited relics, and had clear Christological connotations. In its glimmering glory, this assemblage effectively underscored the connection between the life force of creation, the incarnation of Christ, and his death on the cross that brought salvation into the world. The fact that the relics were not attached to Christ's body itself increases the figure's humanity. In other examples, rock crystal capsules are attached directly onto the body of Christ, which has the opposite effect. The movement in hair and loincloth reveals that the figure is still alive, or rather, that the lay brothers bore witness to the final breath of Christ and the final twist of his body. The movement could also simultaneously suggest the presence of the Holy Spirit, in similar fashion to the well-known symbol of the windswept acanthus. This presence was further underlined by the rock crystals and their reflection of natural light. Wood too was a living material, and one might suggest that the shimmer of light suggested that notion as well. Finally, the figure supplied the relics with a recognizable physical form. It gave them a body and a wholeness that they did not have in themselves. This way, sacredness was able to manifest in a whole anthropomorphic form that was easily understood and could be communicated with, rather than in small fragments of bone and cloth. The figures with concealed relics played on a different register. The presence of concealed relics could not be witnessed through sight, and sacredness was therefore channeled through the figure, not the relics. Two crucifixes from Ribe Cathedral and Vester Church, respectively, both in Southern Jutland, serve as my examples of figures with concealed relics deposited in them. Only the figure from Vester that you see here, has survived. The other one disappeared in the 1950s. Both figures received relics of the 11,000 virgins in 1318 on the 8th of June and the 19th of August, respectively. They were deposited by a cantor at Ribe Cathedral named Thy, who named himself on the parchment note of the figure from Vester. Both figures are most likely local products and are of the Pageants type. They have or had concave chests, hollowed out bellies, visible ribs, deep side wounds, heads leaning towards the shoulder, and a facial expression that shows pain. The surviving figure has been repaired several times and no longer has any of the original polychromy. A container made of copper was deposited inside the head of both figures, containing splinters of bone and a note designating the relics as the 11,000 virgins. The note in the Vester figure specifies that the deposition had happened in the honor of the Holy Cross. The surviving figure is rather small, 101 centimeters tall, and the one from Ribe, which was even more damaged before it disappeared, had a torso that measured 46 centimeters. So they were pretty much identical in shape as well as size. The relics inside the heads were concealed by a wooden plug that would have been covered in paint. The note from the figure from Ribe only states the date and of the deposition and the identity of the relics. But since they are so identical, we may assume that the depositions happened during the same year and were both done by this cantor of Ribe Cathedral. The crucifix from Vester was probably placed above the entrance to the chancel, as we know of no side altars in the church, and since it is too small to serve as the main crucifix. The one from Ribe Cathedral was probably placed above the altar of the chapel dedicated to the 11,000 virgins. Since both crucifixes are small and contain relics, it is likely that they function as cult images and were carried in processions as well. A couple of wills mention processions in Ribe Cathedral. A certain Otto Bosen, who was canon in Ribe, Slesvig, and Lübeck, and presbyter in Varde, made two wills right after each other, one in 1427 and the other in 1429. Both specify that his anniversary masses had to include a procession to the altar of the 11,000 virgins, where two vicars were to pray for his soul. The 1454 will of Jep Iversen Lange, canon at Ribe Cathedral, and older brother to the Bishop of Aarhus, Jens Iversen Lange, specifies that all canons and vicars at the cathedral should go in procession with the Holy Cross of Ribe Cathedral for the salvation of his and his parents' souls. The procession was to take place on every Friday after High Mass, unless there was a major ecclesiastical feast. And it was to begin at the choir, stop at a number of specific side altars, and move through the processional passage. This passage was archaeologically confirmed a few years ago, and excavations show that it went across the cemetery and connected the cathedral and the residency of the canons. So, we know the following. The relics of the 11,000 virgins were deposited in two almost identical crucifixes around the same time, probably during the same year by the same person. The deposition in Westernebel was dedicated to the Holy Cross, and the later will mentions a Holy Cross to be used in processions in Ribe Cathedral. The cathedral had a chapel dedicated to the 11,000 virgins that was a designated spot during processions. I therefore suggest that the Holy Cross used for these processions was in fact the now lost crucifix from Ribe Cathedral, and that the other one had a similar function, possibly as a portable cult image. Such a use of a crucifix is indicated in the land register from Aarhus Cathedral from 1315, where it is specified that the canons had the right to 1/3 of the pious donations that the delegation from the nearby Kysing Church, now just a ruin, would get when that procession with their holy crucifix stopped at the cathedral square. Although the evidence is a bit here and there, I suggest that the concealed relic depositions are more about the figures than it is about the relics. The relics serve to ensoul the figures and transform them into cult images. The cruciform container had no relation to the 11,000 virgins, and the note specified that the deposition was meant to honor the Holy Cross, not the relics themselves. As such, any relic would do when its function was to give sacredness to the figure. In that way, I suggest that the role between relic and container was reversed. The figures were not reliquaries but devotional images, and the relics were meant to animate them, give them souls, and infuse life into them. For the last segment, I would like to shift my focus from anthropomorphic wooden figures towards two miracles where non-anthropomorphic objects animated and bled. One example is the bleeding host from Kippinge on the island of Falster. The other is the bleeding cross from Bistrup north of Roskilde on the island of Zealand. The miracle in Kippinge took place in 1492 and quickly attracted pilgrims. The wonder host was such a powerful relic that it quickly fell under the patronage of the Bishop of Odense and came to live as a legal individual who could own landed and movable property, give out loans, and receive payments on them. In 1518, King Christian II took a loan of the great sum of 1,225 Danish mark from the Holy Sacrament. Other charters dealing with money loans show that large sums were lent and paid back to the bleeding host, while several wills show that it received large sums of money as well as landed and movable property. The host was not anthropomorphic in its outer shape, but its direct link to the body of Christ, given the doctrine of transubstantiation, means that it is still to be understood within the overall framework of the human body. The bleeding cross from Bistrup, called the Crux ad Miranda in the Bistrup Manual, is more abstract. As an object with no anthropomorphic link, its animation mimicking the body's function of bleeding seems a bit curious. Nevertheless, the cross started bleeding in 1402, according to Franciscan friar and annalist Petrus Olaus. The cross is also known from the will of nobleman Eskil Goye from 1505, and it is, as you can see here, depicted on folio 1 recto in the Bistrup Manual, dated to between 1513 and 1522. Here it is shown as a tau cross with 3 holes and a blood-like writing around the crossbar. Beneath the image is a poem which may help us understand it a little better. It says, Salve crux digna super omnia ligna benigna, tu me consigna moriane morte maligna. That roughly translates into, Greetings, dignified cross, above all trees benevolent. You are my sign, lest I die the death of the wicked. So we're dealing with a kind of spell, calling on the cross tree to protect against bad death. The first Lutheran bishop of Zealand, at that time the title was superintendent, but we don't need to get into that. Peter Palladius mentions the Bistrup cross at several points in his book of Visitation from the 1540s, in which he chronicles his visits to churches in his diocese right after the Reformation. Here, he complains about the continued pilgrimages to the idolatrous cross. Although he tried to stop the cult, he did not succeed, and the question of the unruly blood cult was taken up by the Council of the Realm in Roskilde in 1556. In 1564, the council decided that the cult had to be stopped, as can be read in their minutes, where it is also stated that the idolatry in Bistrup was worse than anywhere else in the realm. The same year, the Synodal Statutes of Roskilde Diocese mentions that people still flock to the bleeding cross in Bistrup. In the end, King Frederick II had the church torn down and the idol destroyed. The cult, however, continued and was first associated with the hospital church nearby, then with the Holy Spring near the mill in Bistrup, close to where the church had been. And this Holy Spring is actually still a place of pilgrimage today. Both these blood miracles broke down barriers. As individuals able to own and distribute wealth, they extended beyond the walls of the church and reached into people's social lives and reality. The social bond that existed between people and object lasted for generations, and even the demise of the objects or buildings proved unable to break it. That shows us that the meaningful interaction between object and people played an integral role in keeping the object and its cult alive. It was the interaction which construed and confirmed the life of the object. I argue that these objects became portals, which opened up a direct communicative line between the corporeal and the spiritual spheres. The living blood that flowed from the divine sphere into the physical world of humans flowed from one side to the other and manifested the divine truth for the faithful, intangible physical matter. This way, the bleeding objects acted as corporeal proofs of the Eucharistic mystery. For the wonder host of Kipping, this symbolic layer is easily decodable, as it was a concretization of the doctrine of transubstantiation. For the cross, I believe the poem might help us understand it a little bit better, although one might also argue that bleeding is a very physical sign of a miraculous event that can be pretty easily understood in its own right. The poem, or indeed spell, tells us to focus on the cross as a tree, which was, as we've already seen, itself a living material. In many sources, written as well as iconographical, the tree that became the cross was planted by God at the spring of life, the Fons Vitae. It drank from the very source of life, and at the crucifixion, it drank the living blood that brought salvation into the world of humans, so it could be experienced not only spiritually, but as a physical reality. In that light, the bleeding cross may not be so strange after all. Based on these examples, I propose that blood miracles enable biblical exegesis, Eucharistic symbolism and liturgy, materiality, lay piety, and day-to-day practical economical errands to come together in a perfect symbiosis in the lived and experienced reality of medieval people. The host and the cross became portal between worlds and spheres, mediating symbolic objects loaded with cultural and religious meaning. In that capacity, they were successfully able to unite the worldly and divine spheres in their ritual as well as practical use. Divine immanence and physical presence amalgamated, and the barrier between them collapsed in the lived reality of the cult. On the background of the evidence that I have shared with you, I conclude that the gap between the worldly and the divine spheres were bridged on both sides via mediation. This mediation happened via material things, and through them, divine immanence and worldly presence amalgamated into one form that was simultaneously worldly and divine. The potential for the material to become divine and for the divine to become material was actualized when the spheres met in tangible matter and lived ritual practice. When matter was activated ritually as well as socially, it thus had the potential to break down the barrier between the bodiless spiritual realm and the corporeal physical realm. In short, matter was able to take on the divine immanence and physical presence at the same time, once its potential was activated and actualized. Thank you for your attention.